The year was 1887, and the town of Redemption Bluff was built on a foundation of dust and judgment. It clung to the edge of the vast, unforgiving plains like a stubborn burr on a wolf's hide, a place where the wind was the only constant preacher, its sermons howling through the cracks in the unpainted buildings and carrying away any whispers of hope. The sky was an immense, empty bowl, pressing down on the souls of the people until they became as hard and brittle as the baked earth beneath their feet. Survival here was a form of prayer, and charity was a debt to be repaid with silent, unending subservience. Clara knew this better than anyone. At 10 years old, she was an orphan, a ghost haunting the periphery of the town's consciousness. Her parents had been taken by a fever 2 winters past, their passing as swift and unceremonious as a hawk taking a field mouse. Now, she was a ward of the community, which in practice meant she was the ward of Reverend Hale and his wife, Martha. They had taken her in not out of love, but out of a stark sense of Christian duty, a duty they wore like a hair shirt, its constant chafe a reminder of their own piety. Her life was a litany of chores measured by the rising and setting of a sun she rarely felt on her skin. She slept in a small, cold attic room where the winter wind found every gap in the shingles and the summer heat turned the air to soup. She was a shadow in their home, her presence acknowledged only when a task was left undone or a plate was dropped. The Reverend spoke of God's mercy from the pulpit on Sundays, but in his own home, mercy was a currency Clara could not afford. She was fed, she was clothed in cast-offs, and she was sheltered. For this, she was expected to be grateful, to be silent, and above all, to be invisible. In this world of harsh silence and hollow duty, Clara had one treasure. It was a small doll, stitched from scraps of calico and stuffed with dried grasses. Its face was a simple cross of black thread, its hair yellow yarn unraveling at the ends. It was crude and worn, but it was the last thing her mother's hands had made for her. The doll's fabric still held a phantom scent of wood smoke and lavender, the smell of a life that had been hers, a life with a hearth and a lap, and a love that asked for nothing in return. The doll was her confidant, the silent recipient of her fears and the keeper of her memories. In the deep, lonely hours of the night, she would whisper stories to it, tales of her mother's smile and her father's laugh, trying to keep their shapes from dissolving into the featureless grey of her present. The doll was not just an object, it was the anchor that kept her from drifting away completely. It was proof that she had once been loved, and therefore was perhaps still worthy of it. One sweltering afternoon, a disruption rippled through the tense quiet of Redemption Bluff. A small party of Lakota, perhaps a dozen in all, appeared on the horizon. They were not a war party. They were familiesmen, women, and a few children, their horses lean and their movements weary. They were passing through, a river of life flowing around the rock of the town. They made their way to the creek at the edge of the settlement, the unofficial boundary between the civilized world and the vast, untamed wilderness. Windows and doorways in Redemption Bluff filled with suspicious eyes. Curtains were drawn back just enough to see. The Lakota were a source of fear, the subjects of dark tales told around winter fires. But they ignored the town, their focus solely on the life-giving water of the creek. They dismounted, allowing their horses to drink deep while they refilled their own water skins. Clara had been sent to the creek for a bucket of water, a chore she usually dreaded under the sharp gaze of Martha Hale. But today she forgot the weight of the bucket in her hand. Hidden behind a thicket of willows, she watched. She did not see the boogeymen from the Reverend's sermons. She saw people, tired and thirsty. And then she heard a sound that cut through the soft murmur of their language and the gentle lapping of the water. It was the sound of weeping. A small girl, no older than 5 or 6, was crying with the heart-wrenching, inconsolable grief that only a child can summon. Her small body was racked with sobs. A tall man with a face like carved granite, his hair long and bound with leather, knelt beside her. He spoke to her in soft, low tones, his large hand resting gently on her back. He was clearly her father, his expression a mixture of patience and deep, weary sorrow. But his words, whatever they were, did not soothe her. The child's cries continued, a pure, unvarnished expression of pain in a world that demanded stoicism. From her hiding place, Clara felt a painful lurch in her own chest. She did not understand the child's words, but she understood her tears. It was a language she knew intimately. The sound of that raw despair echoed in the hollow places inside her, the chambers of her heart that still ached for her own mother. The town saw a potential threat. The Reverend, watching from his porch, saw heathens in need of salvation. Clara saw only a little girl who was hurting. An impulse, sudden and overwhelming, rose up in her. It was not born of thought or reason, but from a deeper place, a place that had been dormant for 2 long years. It was the part of her that remembered what it felt like to be comforted. Dropping the bucket, she stepped out from behind the willows. A sudden stillness fell over the group by the creek. The warriors, who had been relaxed, straightened up. Their hands drifted almost casually to the knives at their belts. Their eyes, dark and sharp, fixed on the small, pale girl in the faded dress. In town, Sheriff Callahan put a hand on the pistol at his hip, his knuckles white. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the possibility of violence. But Clara did not see the warrior's hands or the sheriff's fear. Her gaze was fixed on the crying child. She walked forward slowly, her bare feet silent on the dusty bank. She did not have a mother's soft words or a father's comforting hand. She had nothing, except for the doll. Without a moment's hesitation, she reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled it out. The little calico figure, her only link to her past, her only friend in the world. She held it out, her small hand trembling not with fear, but with the gravity of her offering. The tall man, Chaitin, watched her approach, his face an unreadable mask. He saw the worn, precious object in her hand. He saw the earnest, solemn look on her face. He did not move to stop her. Clara knelt in the dust in front of the little girl, whose sobs had quieted to whimpering hitches at the sight of this strange visitor. Clara looked into the child's tear-streaked face and held out the doll. She said nothing. There were no words for what she was doing. It was a gift from one broken heart to another. The little girl, whose name was Zitkala, looked from Clara's face to the doll. Hesitantly, she reached out a small hand and touched the yarn hair. Her crying stopped completely. Her fingers closed around the doll, and she pulled it into her chest, clutching it with a desperate strength. She looked up at Clara, her dark eyes wide with a dawning wonder. Clara felt a profound and painful tearing inside her. The giving of the doll was like giving away the last piece of her own story. Her hand was empty. Her pocket was empty. She felt a new, sharper kind of loneliness rush in to fill the space. But as she looked at the little girl, who was now stroking the doll's calico dress, a strange sense of peace settled over her. For the first time in 2 years, she had done something that was truly her own. An act that was not born of duty or fear, but of a simple, shared humanity. Chaitin's gaze was heavy on her. He looked at his daughter, now quiet and clutching the doll as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Then his eyes returned to Clara. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the threadbare dress, the thin shoulders, the profound sadness in her young eyes. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a thank you. It was something more. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the sacrifice she had made. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, the Lakota gathered their things and mounted their horses. Chaitin swung his daughter up in front of him, and she did not protest, her cheek pressed against the calico doll. The party moved on, melting back into the vastness of the plains, leaving behind only the damp earth by the creek and the stunned silence of the town. Clara picked up her forgotten bucket, its weight feeling heavier than before. As she walked back towards the parsonage, she did not look at the faces in the windows. She could feel their judgment like a physical blow. "Where have you been, girl?" Martha Hale's voice was as sharp as broken glass. "Dallying with savages. Did you give them something? I saw you." Clara said nothing, her throat tight. "Answer me, what did you give them?" "Nothing," Clara whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "I gave them nothing." She received a sharp slap for her insolence and a lecture from the Reverend that evening on the perils of consorting with heathens, who were, he declared, soulless creatures, incapable of true feeling. She was sent to her attic room without supper. That night was the longest of Clara's life. The emptiness in her apron pocket was a vast, echoing chasm. She reached for the doll out of habit, her fingers closing on nothing but air. The grief was so sharp it felt like a physical wound. She had given away her mother, she had given away her past. She cried silently into her thin pillow, mourning the doll with a ferocity that surprised her. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. It was the memory of the little girl's crying stopping, the memory of the father's solemn nod. She had connected a broken thread, not for herself, but for someone else. In her desolate world, that single act shone with a strange and bewildering light. She had no regrets. The next morning, the world changed. It began not with the crowing of the rooster, but with a low, rumbling thunder that was not from the sky. The ground itself seemed to hum, a deep vibration that rattled the windows in their frames. Clara, awake in her attic, felt it first. She crept to the small, dusty window that overlooked the plains. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The horizon was no longer empty. It was filled from one end to the other with riders, hundreds of them. Lakota warriors, their faces painted, their horses restless, the morning sun glinting off the tips of their lances. They were not the weary travelers from the day before. This was a war party, a silent, disciplined army that had materialized from the dust of the plains. They halted just beyond the creek, a living wall of muscle and menace, their stillness more terrifying than any war cry. Panic erupted in Redemption Bluff like a flash flood. The single church bell began to ring, not in a steady peal for Sunday service, but in a frantic, desperate clangor of alarm. Men, half-dressed, spilled from their houses with rifles in their hands, their faces pale with terror. Women screamed and gathered their children. The town that had felt so solid and righteous an hour before was now a fragile, terrified island in a sea of warriors. "It's the girl," someone shouted. "The orphan girl. She's brought this curse on us." The fear in the town needed a target, and it found one in Clara. The whispers turned to accusations, the suspicion to open blame. Reverend Hale's face was a mask of righteous fury. "I warned her," he thundered to the small, frightened crowd gathering in the street. "She consorted with the devil's children, and now he has come to collect his due. She has doomed us all." Clara shrank back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was the cause of this. Her small, foolish act of kindness had brought an army to their door. She scrambled to the darkest corner of the attic, pulling an old crate in front of her, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. The angry shouts from the street below were as sharp as stones. Sheriff Callahan, a pragmatic man whose authority had evaporated in the face of such overwhelming odds, was trying to create some semblance of order. He knew their dozen hunting rifles were nothing against this force. He knew that a single arrow, a single shot, would be their end. Then, a small group of riders detached from the main body and trotted forward. At their head was Chaitan, the tall warrior from the day before. He was not in war paint. His face was grave, his bearing regal. He stopped at the edge of town, holding up a hand in a sign of peace, though the army at his back made the gesture feel like a profound threat. One of the men with him spoke in clear, if heavily accented, English. "We have come to see the girl," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "The one they call Clara." The demand hung in the air, simple and absolute, the life of one insignificant orphan girl against the survival of the entire town. To Clara, hiding in the attic, the words were a death sentence. They had come for her. Sheriff Callahan looked at Reverend Hale, whose face was a mixture of fear and a terrible, triumphant justification. "Give them the girl," the Reverend hissed. "She brought this upon herself. It is God's will." The sheriff's face hardened. He was a man of the law, but the law had no power here. Survival did. He nodded grimly and pushed his way into the parsonage. He found Clara cowering in the attic, her body trembling so violently she could barely stand. "Come on, child," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "They're asking for you. We have no choice." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she nodded. There was nowhere left to run. She followed the sheriff out into the blinding sunlight, her legs unsteady beneath her. The entire town was watching, their faces a mixture of fear and relief. They were willing to sacrifice her to save themselves. As she walked, she felt a profound and final loneliness. She was truly, utterly alone. She stopped at the edge of the street, a small, trembling figure in a faded dress, facing the imposing line of warriors. Chaitin dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate. He walked towards her, his tall frame casting a long shadow that enveloped her completely. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes searching her face. He did not look angry. He looked solemn. The translator stepped forward. The silence was so complete that Clara could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. Chaitin began to speak, his voice a low, resonant baritone. The translator's words followed, weaving a story that stunned the very air. "Our leader, Chaitin, says this." The translator began. "His daughter, Zitkala, has been in a deep shadow of grief. 3 weeks ago, her mother walked the spirit road. She left this world." A murmur went through the watching townspeople. "The only thing the child had left of her mother was a doll," the translator continued, his voice steady. "A doll her mother made for her with her own hands. 2 days ago, as we crossed the great river, the doll was swept away by the current. It was gone. With it, the child's spirit seemed to be gone too. She would not eat. She would not speak. She only wept. Her grief was a stone that we could not lift." Chaitin's eyes never left Clara's face. He could see the understanding dawning in her expression, replacing the terror. "Yesterday," the translator said, "you came to her. You, a stranger, a child with nothing, and you gave her your own doll. He says the doll you gave her, it looked almost the same, made with the same love. When his daughter held it, the stone of her grief was lifted. She spoke. She smiled. You gave her back a piece of her mother's spirit." Clara's breath hitched. She looked at the formidable warrior, and for the first time she saw the father, the grieving husband, the man who had been helpless to ease his own child's pain. "Chaitin says that an act of war is understood." The translator's voice grew stronger, ringing across the dusty street. "An act of greed is understood, but this act, for one child who has nothing to give her only comfort, her only memory, to another child simply to soothe her sorrow. This is an act of a spirit so strong and a heart so pure that it is a thing of great power. It is an honor that must be witnessed. He did not bring his warriors here for war." Chaitin took a step forward and spoke the next words himself, in his own language, his voice full of a profound respect. The translator's voice followed. "He brought them here to see the girl with the mighty heart. He brought them here to honor you." The town of Redemption Bluff stood in stunned, absolute silence. Their judgment, their fear, their petty cruelties, all of it, shriveled to dust in the face of this astonishing revelation. Reverend Hale's mouth hung open, his righteous condemnation turned to ashes on his tongue. Chaitin turned and gestured to one of his men. The man came forward leading a pony, a beautiful creature with a coat the color of dappled sunlight and a mane like black silk. Another warrior brought a thick, heavy blanket, woven with intricate geometric patterns in brilliant colors of sky blue and sunset red. Chaitin took the blanket and unfolded it. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a powerful man, he draped it around Clara's thin shoulders. Its weight was warm and comforting, a shield against the coldness of the world she had known. "He declares you a friend to the Lakota people," the translator said, his voice filled with emotion. "You are named Wichapi Owangila, one, Star Woman. For you are a single bright light in the darkness. This pony is yours, this blanket is yours, and the protection of our people is yours. No harm will come to you while we draw breath." Chaitan placed a hand briefly on Clara's head, a gesture of blessing. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and without a backward glance at the town, led his warriors away. They moved as one, a silent, flowing river, disappearing back into the plains as mysteriously as they had come, leaving behind only the dust settling in the morning light. In the aftermath, a new kind of silence fell over Redemption Bluff. It was not the silence of fear, but of awe and shame. Clara stood wrapped in the magnificent blanket, the reins of her own pony held loosely in her hand. She was no longer the town's burden, its forgotten ghost. She was one-star woman. She was the girl who had been honored by 500 warriors. Her life in the parsonage was irrevocably altered. Martha Hale no longer dared to raise her voice, let alone her hand, to the girl who was under the declared protection of the Lakota nation. The Reverend spoke no more of soulless heathens. He had witnessed a spirit more profoundly Christian than his own. The townspeople, who had once shunned her, now nodded respectfully as she passed, their eyes holding a new and unfamiliar light. But Clara's transformation was deeper than the town's grudging acceptance. As she cared for her pony and slept under the warmth of her blanket, she understood. She had given away the last tangible piece of her past, an act that had felt like severing her final anchor. But in doing so, she had not been left adrift. She had been given a future. She had learned that kindness was a language that needed no translator, that empathy was a force more powerful than any army. She had found a new kind of home, not within the walls of the town, but in the vast, open knowledge of the connection she had forged a bond, built not of words or laws, but from the simple, shared heartbeat of two lonely children and one selfless gift. The plains no longer seemed empty to her. They were full of a silent promise, a silent friendship, watching over her like a single, steady star in the immense and beautiful sky.